Hi, everybody. Just wanted to give you a brief overview of our goals for this particular unit. So this week we're working on facilitating meaningful mathematics discourse, which before you got to the module, you should have already read that little brief section in Principles to Action. But the whole goal here, this is where we start to see all the pieces coming together. So if you think about what makes a really good mathematics lesson, as we've said, the tasks you engage your students working around are some of the most important things you do. And then they need time to work together and thinking both independently and together, thinking about those tasks. And then finally, we bring it to the whole group to have a discussion about their work. And this is where um, the connection making happens. This is where we start to formalize important mathematical ideas. This is where you get a chance to really push your students forward in their precise mathematical language and so forth. Um, but discussions are not necessarily the easiest thing to do. Um, so let me see here. So our whole goal with mathematical discussions is to provide students opportunities to share ideas and clarify their conversations, to develop convincing arguments regarding how things work and why things work, to develop a language for expressing their mathematical ideas and seeing things from others' perspectives. So I think you can kind of see some of those effective teaching practices that we've been talking about, and even more importantly, the mathematical practices that your students are supposed to be developing through your class right here. So the key challenge in this is to both build on and honor student thinking while ensuring the mathematical ideas at the heart of the lesson remain prominent. I would say the most common mistake I see when it comes to having mathematical discussions after students have had a chance to explore a task is the idea that I have to give everybody an opportunity to share what they did, in which case the discussion turns into show and tell. And that's what we really want to avoid. So when we talk about orchestrating a mathematical discussion, that means making really purposeful choices about who is sharing and the purpose for asking them to share. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Um, and on top, not just today, I'm sorry, across the week, but on top of that, then once we've made those selections about the who and how and why, then how do we actually support that work together? So it was mentioned in Principles to Actions, the 5 practices. And I'm going to actually have you read a brief, there's a whole book on this. And if you ask your colleagues or cooperating teachers, this is a book they've heard of. It's one that's made a huge difference because it actually does a great job of giving structure to how to even think about doing this. So the article you're going to read gives an overview with an example, and then we're going to dig into some more examples here. But the 5 practices are essentially, we know we need to start with an open, high-demand task with appropriate learning goals. So you first choose that task. Once that task has been selected, the 5 practices are anticipate, monitor, select, sequence, and connect. So anticipate is kind of what we did a little bit of that last week. When we're anticipating, we're thinking about all of the possible solutions or strategies that students might use. So different strategies they might use, different conceptions they might bring to the idea that maybe we need to watch out for because we know they're going to cause problems moving forward. So that's the anticipating part. And along with the anticipating part means anticipating questions I could pose. Coming up with good questions in the moment is really, really hard. However, if you've sat down and jotted down a few questions that if I see students that are doing this, here are questions that I could ask to push them forward. Here are questions I could ask to understand it better. You'll be prepared and ready to use those. So that's something really important to think about. Monitoring is what happens during kind of our launch and explore part of a lesson. So you've launched your task. So in other words, you've introduced that particular task to your students in a way that they know how to get started on it, and you haven't given away you haven't lowered the cognitive demand at all. So they're now working on the task, whether it's independently for a little while and then in small groups, or you have them go to small groups immediately, independently and then pairs, whatever you've decided is appropriate for this particular lesson. After you've launched it, students are exploring. And during that time, your job is to be monitoring their work. And during your monitoring, you're not just standing over their shoulders and trying to see what they're doing. You're asking them questions. That's where your assessing and advancing questions come in, because you're trying to get a sense of what is their current thinking, how can I help them move forward. At the same time, you're also paying attention to the different ideas that are out in your classroom, so you can select the ones that you're going to bring to the forefront when you have a class discussion. You'll see, and I think you saw in the article, you're going to read an article, as I said. I'm going to repeat that 10 times, I'm sorry. When you read the article, and we're going to, as we move forward, we're going to think about some ways of organizing, like we call it a monitoring sheet, just so you have a way of keeping track of things. Because if you've got a classroom of 30 students, thinking about remembering who's doing what so that you can appropriately select who you want to include in the discussion is difficult to do. So having a monitoring sheet can really help with that. And a monitoring sheet, all that really is here are all the things I anticipated students might do. And then I keep track of which groups actually are using those. And I have space there to add in other things that maybe I didn't think about. So it's just a way for me to keep track so that as I'm getting ready to come to my class discussion, I can then select which ones I'm going to bring up to the front for us to discuss. And when you select and then sequence the idea, sequencing means if I chose these 3 groups work that we're going to talk about today, it's for a particular purpose, and I'm going to put them in a particular order. And that order can be really helpful in moving forward the discussion as I'm hoping it unfolds. And we're going to talk about ways you might do that. So if you have a monitoring sheet where you've kept track of the maybe you anticipated 4 different ways students might go about it, you just jot down the names of who's done what, or the group numbers, depending on how they're working. If there's some other idea that you didn't think about, you had room to jot it down there and keep track of who did it. And then you've already thought, hopefully, in your planning, ideally, I want to bring up to the front for us to discuss an example of this, this, and this because of how they help your discussion. And then you think about, okay, how am I going to connect those? So I've made my decision while I've been monitoring who I'm going to select, what order I'm going to put them in, and then when we have our class discussion, my goal then is to bring out the connections among those. So these are the 5 practices. You are going to hear that over and over again. So when we say the 5 practices, it is these 5 things: anticipate, monitor, select, sequence, and connect. And again, it was in Principles to Action. You're going to read another article about it in just a few minutes. So just as an example, I'm going to have you watch a video of a class. And right now, all I want you to do is just pay attention to the discussion. So you're not seeing the launch of the task. They did this counting cubes task. I have the task posted right below this video as well, so you don't have to pause it here. You're going to see a video. It's about 8 minutes long of an 8th grade class, Mr. Dubnow's class, where they're having their whole class discussion around this particular task. His goals for this task is he wanted his students to understand that an equation can describe the relationship between 2 quantities, in this case the number of cubes and the building number. We're calling these towers buildings. That's how he referred to them in the video. He also has a goal that he wants different but equivalent equations. He wants the students to understand that different but equivalent equations can represent the same situation, and that connections can be made between pictorial and, pictorial and symbolic representations. And to do so, variables have to be clearly defined. So those are his big goals. So what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes and actually work through this task. Like everything we do, it's really important that you sit and think hard about the mathematics first yourself before you watch the students do something. Just like you would in your own planning, in order to make sense of these videos or other students' work, it's important that you thought about the task first. So take a few minutes, work through this task, see if you can come up with 2 different ways to do number 4. And then when you're watching the video, I've got a couple of prompts down there that I want you to think about. But right now we're just getting a sense of what might a good class discussion look like. And like any video I show you, no class discussion is ever perfect because we can always do it better. But think about what was really done well here. Who was talking, what connections were being made, whose ideas were being shared. How did Mr. Dunbow kind of orchestrate this whole thing? and the particular prompts that I have down below here. And then we will move on. So after watching that video, there's you'll read down where I highlight a few things that I hope you noticed. And then at the end is a really brief article. It's about 3 pages about the 5 practices that I'd like you to read before moving forward. All right, go give this task a try. Thank you.